Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas here with my co-host Ben Rebellis. And today, of course, we are going to talk about the midterm election results. It's been about 2 weeks since the midterms took place. And I'm glad that we've waited 2 weeks because it means that the results have kind of settled. It wasn't exactly clear what had happened at first, but it's pretty clear now that essentially the Democrats had a victory in the midterms, an unusual victory because they are the party that controls the presidency, but they only narrowly lost the House of Representatives, very, very narrowly. They gained a couple of governorships. They actually gained a seat in the Senate, not only maintained the Senate, but in all likelihood will gain a seat, assuming that the runoff in Georgia goes the way that I think most people think it's going to go. And so we're going to talk about that. And then later in the show, we will talk about the fact that Donald Trump has announced he is running for president again in 2024, as many people expected, as maybe some people were hoping he would not. But to get started off, we'll talk about the midterms. I want to make a note at the beginning of the show that if you watched the show 2 weeks ago, I made some predictions, and I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I did my best to remove my feelings from those predictions and tell you guys what I thought was going to happen, not what I wanted to happen. And it seems like I did a pretty good job, because if I had predicted what I wanted to happen, I would have predicted a Republican tidal wave, and I would be apologizing to all of you now, as so many other commentators on the right have had to do for getting it wrong. In reality, what I did was I told you that there would be perhaps maybe a small Republican tide and that they would narrowly lose the Senate, which is exactly what happened, that they would take the House, I said by a margin slightly larger than they did. So I got that one off by a little bit, but I did not say it would be a tidal wave in the House. I said they would gain 20 seats. They gained 10, essentially. I didn't tell you 30 or 40. And in governorships, I was off by a few. I said they would pick up a governorship. They ended up losing 2. So, I missed 3 governor's races. I missed only 1 Senate race. I was off in the House by about 10. But I'll just say to the audience, if you're looking for somebody who's going to take their feelings out of these predictions each time the elections roll around and tell you what is actually going to happen, I seem to have done a pretty good job. So I'll toot my own horn for just a second there. Frickin' Nevada was the only Senate race that I missed. I almost nailed the Senate dead on. I'm a little upset about that because it was only off by 1%. But of course, the thing I'm most upset about and that I want to get into is that Republicans just did so damn poorly in the elections. They did not do well. Initially, and I'm glad we're doing the show now with a couple weeks of separation, initially it wasn't clear if Republicans had done kind of lousy, disappointing, or if they had just done terribly. They did pretty awful considering that they did take the House of Representatives. So there's your bright spot for the Republicans. They were able to narrowly take control of the House of Representatives. That is the good news for Republicans. The bad news is everything else. The bad news is the margin in the House is extremely small. It's not even clear that Kevin McCarthy will have the votes to be elected Speaker of the House because he's only going to have a 4, maybe 5 seat majority in the House of Representatives. The Democrats appear like they will gain a seat in the Senate, and governorships, the Republicans really didn't expand the map once. They did okay in governorships. There was some good news there because of some interesting regional variants that we're going to get to in a minute. But at the end of the day, it was an extremely disappointing night because a lot of people followed their feelings, took some advice from old Ben Kenobi and searched their feelings and tried to, will the Republicans into a tidal wave tsunami victory. That did not happen. It did not even come close to happening. There was essentially a trickle of victories in the House, just big enough to get them the House, and not much else happening for Republicans. I want to talk about why this is, and I'm going to start by throwing it to my co-host, Ben. Why do you think Republicans underperformed so much, considering they're the opposition party in a midterm year that almost always means you can shellac the president's party pretty well? The economy is lousy, and yet they just didn't do very well.
I think it comes down to a couple things. First, I think it's undeniable that Trump is an element here, and the concept of election denialism, which is a term I really don't like. But I think that we'll probably get into that later in the show since we are going to talk about Trump, unfortunately. But I just don't think the Republican Party had a really solid affirmative argument going into this election. Most of the Republican narrative, it was, look how crazy the Democrats have gotten. Don't vote for them. Vote for me instead. And so I was writing notes for this episode, and I was trying to remember what the Republican platform was in any given case, in any given state. And I really was coming up blank when you struck out those positions or really just counter arguments. Where was immigration? I feel like I didn't hear a whole bunch about that. I mean, yeah, you've got DeSantis' stunt sending migrants to Abbott in Texas. That was there, but that wasn't an argument. That was just, hey, look how big a problem it is. I wasn't seeing many solutions being put out there. Where was the message about fiscal responsibility or smaller government? Well, the Republicans have really thrown that one away a while back, but I think that's what people want to see, especially with inflation being as high as it is. The one affirmative argument that I think could only be used by people who actually could do it credibly was how they handled COVID. And this specifically was a strength for DeSantis. He opened his victory speech talking about the freedom in Florida and how it won while I live in a city, but I come from a rural area in my state, and the people in rural areas do not want to hear anything close to ever implementing COVID restrictions again. Of course, in my small hometown, they were like that in May 2020. But still, now I could be wrong here because that doesn't explain why Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan was reelected. And that may speak to her opponent more so than it speaks to her record on COVID. But most Republicans really did, as well as the Democrats failed when it came to reacting to COVID sensibly. And so that's the only real thing that I think gave Republican candidates a big boost in it was that type of response. But everywhere else, I feel like they were very reactive, and that just doesn't make for good persuasion.
Yeah, this election was interesting because there was a lot of regional variance. I think your point about was there an affirmative argument is an important one. And I do want to talk about the economy in a minute as well, because that should be addressed. But that's an interesting point about the lack of an affirmative argument, because certainly the Democrats, I mean, they just went are you really going to elect all these election deniers? And that more or less kind of worked, because a lot of election deniers, again, a term that I don't particularly love either, but I don't know if there's a better word for people who deny that Joe Biden's the duly elected president of the United States. That's a little bit of a mouthful. So we'll go with election deniers. I will do something I rarely do, which is borrow a turn of phrase from CNN and MSNBC. Because they loved, I remember CNN, I was watching their election night coverage, and they would, every time they'd be like, and an unrepentant election denier is losing in Arizona. Like, they would say that about every single candidate. But the regional variance in this election, folks, not an erection, an election. That's what happens when you don't do your red leather, yellow leather before the show. So it was an election. If it was an erection, that would have been a lot more interesting for CNN. So in the 2022 midterm elections, the regional variance was very interesting because the affirmative argument that Ben was mentioning before, I think it was made. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis you could consider them stunts, but they were trying to make some kind of point through those stunts about immigration. They did do things with abortion, with critical race theory and gender ideology in schools, particularly Ron DeSantis, but I think to a lesser extent also Greg Abbott has been working on those issues closely with Chris Rufo and other activists. But the thing that is so interesting about that is those candidates all actually did pretty well. Greg Abbott was able, and of course the quality of their opponents is also a question you can bring up. Beto O'Rourke, Stacey Abrams, and what was his name? Charlie Crist. Yeah, I think is his name, in Florida, a guy who's lost, I think, 3 times statewide. He had one term as governor like 12 years ago and has just kind of been riding that after a party switch, no less. So you saw all of these candidates do pretty well. And I think what it was here are candidates in Brian Kemp, Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, and to some extent Lee Zeldin in New York. He didn't win his race, but he came a lot closer than any Republican has any right to in New York State. That was the closest New York governor election in 20 years since George Pataki was reelected in 2002. So Lee Zeldin did very well. I think what all these candidates were able to do is say, hey, look, I'm going to make this argument, and added bonus, I'm not a fucking crazy person. Like I'm actually a competent person that you watch giving speeches and feel comfortable having as your governor. And certainly I think Zeldin made people feel that way. I think Kemp and Abbott, and then Ron DeSantis really more so than anybody. I mean, you saw, I think Greg Abbott won by like 11 points against Beto O'Rourke, pretty weak candidate. Brian Kemp won by something like 8 or 9%. Lee Zeldin coming within 5 or 6 points of Kathy Hochul, all actually living up to the expectations of what people kind of thought was going to happen in these states. If that had been maintained nationwide, there would have been a Republican wave if all candidates had performed this way. But it was DeSantis who really did something unprecedented. Ron DeSantis's electoral result in the 2022 midterm elections, it gave me chills. It was astounding because no one saw that coming. No candidate in statewide office in Florida, which has been a purple state up until the last 2 years, no one should be able to win a statewide race by 20%. That is unthinkable for a Republican to win, not keep pace with, win Latinos, win Miami-Dade County. Ron DeSantis won the Latino vote, won Miami-Dade County. He turned Florida from a purple state to a ruby red state. I cannot overstate the awesome power of what Ron DeSantis did. And it did give me chills on election night. It got me excited because Florida's results come in first. And I said, this is going according to plan. Ron DeSantis with a 20% victory. But then the regional variance came into play, where we saw in other states, Republicans severely underperforming. And this affected them in the House of Representatives because if you're at the top of the ticket, like Lee Zeldin and Ron DeSantis, Republicans actually were able to net some House seats in New York and Florida because they had a strong top of the ticket. Again, Lee Zeldin didn't win, but he was able to drag some Republicans in the House over the finish line with a better than average performance. So I think, and when it comes to that affirmative argument, I think the Republicans had one. I think they actually were kind of working one out. And Ron DeSantis said it in his victory speech. He said, we will never give in to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
Yeah.
And he made clear that he has every intention of being the culture warrior in chief of the Republican Party if they will allow him to do so. And we'll get to that in a bit because there's somebody else who'd like to do that named Donald Trump. And there are some people who really like him. I don't know if you know that. But Ron DeSantis made that case. And I think that each Republican's ability to really understand that, I think a lot of it has to do with their age. I think some of the older guys don't really understand the culture war all that well. Ron DeSantis is relatively young, in his mid-40s. Somebody like Greg Abbott, who I think is more so in their 60s and 70s, I think has a harder time. Brian Kemp, certainly. These older guys, I don't think really understand what's going on with the culture war. So they're not as credible when they talk about it. DeSantis really nails it. And when he said Florida is where woke goes to die, I think that he was basically saying, why didn't everyone just do what I did, which is go to war with wokeness. But don't make it hard for people to sympathize with you and with your side, which is what Trump has done for 4 years. And all of the candidates he endorsed, with the exceptions of J.D. Vance and Ted Budd in North Carolina, did very poorly in the election.
What do you think explains that?
I think that it's pretty straightforward. I mean, J.D. Vance is in a very red state at this point. Ohio is a state that has become pretty darn conservative. North Carolina, where Ted Budd is a state that also leans to the right. A state that Donald Trump actually won in 2020 as well as 2016, if memory serves. So, you know, I think they also were candidates that didn't lean nearly as much into the election conspiracy theorizing. They weren't as god awful on the campaign trail. I mean, I'll give credit to Carrie Lake and Adam Laxalt, two losing candidates, also Blake Masters to some extent. These candidates were all endorsed by Trump and lost, but they at the very least were decent on the stump. I mean, these were all people who I think did make at least Republicans feel comfortable voting for them. They just did poorly with independents because of their playing footsies with election conspiracies. Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz are the ones where there's just no excuse. I mean, these were candidates that could never win statewide. And this, I kind of put my neck out when I put out my prediction saying that Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker would lose. Herschel Walker may still win, but I think he will lose. But I certainly said that Dr. Oz would lose, and he lost by 5%. He didn't even come that close against a candidate who's been showing severe cognitive impairments after a severe stroke. And I think that, you know, Vance is a really smart guy. I kind of like J.D. Vance. I'm actually glad Trump endorsed him. I'm glad he's in the Senate. I think he'll be a great senator. Ted Budd, I don't know that much about. He's a little more boring. I can't really speak to Ted Budd in North Carolina that much. I'm glad he won. I can say that much. But, you know, I think Vance kind of is in a class of his own. He's a long time, you know, conservative intellectual who was actually critical of Trump at one point, but he's sort of gotten back in his good graces. But also, you know, I watched his debates with Tim Ryan. He never took anything to the point where he was Herschel Walkerizing himself or Dr. Ozifying himself. He ran a decent campaign, even if he was a first-time candidate. I understand he struggled with fundraising a little bit. But I just have to say that the Trumpy candidates all lost. And so one of the things we learned from this election, and one of the reasons Republicans did so poorly, is candidates matter. Like, you can't make an affirmative argument when your opening up your chest cavity and showing your weak spot, which is being a Trumpy candidate that suburban moms and dads don't like, the suburbs being where the swing voters are. You're opening up that weak spot, as Kari Lake did. As to some extent, I love Blake Masters. I think he's a very cool guy. He did not run the best campaign, in my opinion. And Adam Laxalt in Nevada, who I really thought was going to win and ultimately didn't. Even if you weren't Herschel Walker or Dr. Oz, even if you just kind of played footsies with these election conspiracies and you went Trumpy, even if you did it in a more articulate way like Kari Lake did, it didn't work. And it made it hard to make people focus on the things that Ron DeSantis has been fighting with executive power as governor of Florida, as well as Abbott, Brian Kemp, and these other governors. So it came down to candidate quality in so many races. And before we go further, I just want to mention on the economy real quick. I think the economy is not as much of a factor as people think it is. I think that if the economy is in absolute shambles, it certainly hurts the president's party. Right now, the economy is bad. It's lousy. Inflation is very high. The stock market is very volatile, although in the month leading up to the election, it did seem to recover slightly. But unemployment is extremely low. Unemployment is very, very low. Not the best thing for the economy, but certainly it's not in the worst case scenario. In 2010, for instance, unemployment was like 10% the week before the midterms. Barack Obama got shellacked famously in the 2010 midterms. So I think the economy wasn't where the Republicans wanted it to be. I mean, far be it for me to say that Republicans want the economy to be bad, but I think right before a midterm election, they might. But I also just think that people are pretty ideologically entrenched. They won't necessarily blame the president of their party if the economy is bad. If you're a Democrat, you're just going to say, well, there's these election deniers, the economy be damned. I think there's some truth to that hyperpartisanship has weakened it's the economy stupid model of political consulting.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I think I would tussle a little bit with, the economy's, not as bad, especially unemployment numbers, which I think are misleading because we really want to look at labor force participation rate, which is not great. And there's actually a couple authors right now running the podcast circuits that are talking about, especially like 26 to 45-ish aged men, how many of them are not in the labor force at all and not looking for a job. And how the welfare state's really supporting them being able to do that. But I think that's right. It's so hard for me. It's hard for me to believe that people are changing their minds to go from Democrat to Republican. Like that just doesn't seem, the people I've seen talk to, the people I talk to myself, that just doesn't seem a realistic possibility if you've decided to put on the blue shirt or the red shirt and to keep it on throughout the midterms. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think Republicans are just making it harder than it needs to be. I mean, this midterm election, for as disappointing as it was for me, I did want to see Republicans do well at the end of the day. The silver lining for me has been this was the best possible result for people that don't like Donald Trump, which was that his candidates did so poorly, and Ron DeSantis, his only legitimate challenger in the 2024 primaries, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, it just did so well.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks like, there's one outstanding election. That's the Senate in Alaska, where it's two Republicans in a sort of weird, runoff ranked choice situation. It looks like Trump's candidate there is going to lose. I mean, he got demolished in his statewide endorsements outside of North Carolina and Ohio. He just did awful. I know I've said it a few times, but it's hard to overstate how bad of a night Donald Trump had on November 8th, 2022. It was a bad night for him and a pretty awful night for the Republican Party as well. One of the things I had in my notes is who to hold accountable for this. Trump is at the top of that list, but I don't know if there's anyone else, Ben, that comes to mind. Some people were kind of getting upset with Mitch McConnell because he had funneled money apparently out of Blake Masters. He kind of gave up on Blake Masters pretty early in the cycle and funneled money into defending Lisa Murkowski, that race I just mentioned in Alaska from a Trumpy primary challenge. I mean, Blake, to be honest, I never thought was actually as good of a candidate as a lot of people thought he was. I think he's a very smart guy that I'd love to talk to, but I mean, he had never run for office before. He was pretty clearly a Peter Thiel plant. I mean, he works for Peter Thiel, and I think that kind of creeped people out a little bit, that there's sort of this crypto billionaire like meddling in the primary, where, Thiel was able to whisper in Trump's ears, like, here's your guy, his name's Blake.
Yeah. Although I will say, I don't know much about Blake Masters. I know he might have gotten a little MAGA, whatever, but his roots, how he came up in politics, or at least his political thinking, was like Austrian school economics, like Mises, Rothbard, that type of thing. So that made him an attractive candidate for me, which is why the Libertarian candidate in that race actually dropped out and endorsed Masters, and other leading figures in the new face of the Libertarian Party actually were okay with that decision.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing is that, unfortunately, Ben, you're not the profile of a swing voter in Arizona. I think that's more McCain Republican, and Carrie Lake literally had a rally. Come on, Carrie. I mean, for anyone that saw this, Carrie Lake had a rally where she said, "Are there any McCain Republicans in the room?" And then some people, like maybe one or two people raised their hands. She goes, "You should get out." Or she was like, "What?" She was like, "Boo, boo the McCain Republicans." Well, Carrie Lake lost by a margin that probably could have been covered by McCain Republicans in Arizona, because there's a lot of McCain Republicans in Arizona, a state where John McCain was a senator for 30 years?
For a long time.
Yeah, and ran for president and was a war hero and remains a very popular and beloved American figure for his service to this country, both in and out of the war zone. I mean, it just baffles me, the self-inflicted wounds in this election cycle, and there needs to be some accountability. We did need to talk about it today. I'm not, I think the most unfortunate thing about this, I haven't really talked about the Democrats much today. It's going to embolden them. That's the thing that I fear. And a point that I'll make is, and I want to throw this to you in a second, Ben, how much you think this is going to embolden the Democrats and the activists that seem to be, the inmates who seem to have taken over the asylum on the left. But I would posit that I don't think the activists were ever going to stop. Like, I think no matter what had happened, if there had been a Republican tsunami in this, the activists do what an activist is going to do. Like, activists on the left will always go hard in the paint, just like crazy bullshit, critical race theory, gender ideology for pre-K 4-year-olds, pumping hormones into children. Like, they're always going to do that. The thing that you can do in a midterm, though, is take the actual political leaders, like, now it's going to be Hakeem Jeffries. It was Nancy Pelosi in the House, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden. And you can send a message to them like, look, you do need votes. And if you keep doing this, you're not going to get votes. And at the end of the day, you cannot maintain power without our votes. We live in a fucking democracy. And I think there was an opportunity to check Joe Biden when he invites, transgender influencers of, questionable transgender status into the White House to interview him 2 days before an election, and says that he supports child mutilation of children for gender affirming care. And I am putting that in air quotes for our audio listeners. There was an opportunity to check the actual office holders in the Democratic Party, not the activists. They're going to do what they're going to do. But Joe Biden gave a speech after the election, and it was incumbent on him to do so because he essentially won. And he said, well, back to the same old, just going to keep doing what I've been doing. And it's like, well, what a missed opportunity for Republicans.
Yeah. To your point, I think if there had been a red tsunami, all these terms are annoying, but if there had been a red tsunami, that would have just been evidence to support the CRT activist assertions. They would have just used that to say, look at what a white supremacist nation this is. They're electing all these election deniers and white men and blah, 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 blah. Boring. The question I kind of had is, were any of the on the point of whether this is going to embolden wokeness, were any of the candidates that beat Republicans particularly woke in the mixed up races? I feel like I might have heard that about Fetterman, but from what I can tell, that's not what got him elected. What got him elected was Oz was a bad candidate. And you know better than I do. I just don't think it was the woke message that propelled any of these candidates, like really made the victory substantiate here. I don't see gender affirming, I'll use air quotes too, care for 12-year-olds, the conspiracy theory of structural racism, climate hyperventilation. That really wasn't, to borrow a phrase from a friend of mine, the straw that stirs the drink when it came to the elected officials. It doesn't, those types of ideologies don't play in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nevada, Arizona, and they certainly don't play in Florida.
Yeah, I think this is a good point, and it speaks to the fact that, and I've mentioned this on the show before, Democrats do a very good job of making it appear that they are not nearly as intimately connected to their activist class as they actually are. Beto O'Rourke is known for being a kind of obnoxious white male woke guy. He did very poorly. Stacey Abrams did very poorly. Trying to think if there were any particularly woke Democratic candidates. The squad, they're all in safe Democratic districts, so they're not the best case study. No, I think Democrats did a pretty good job. A lot of their candidates were incumbents who, are from the establishment wing of the party. Fetterman is interesting because he is significantly to the left of even Democrats in Pennsylvania. He actually won a primary over a much more establishment Democratic candidate named Connor Lamb, who I always thought, by the way, would be a great Democratic presidential candidate, Connor Lamb. Although that's not to be because Fetterman wiped the floor with him in the primary. But you are right that Fetterman's campaign ended up being completely thrown into disarray by his own stroke and Dr. Oz's, status as his opponent. The presence of Dr. Oz in that race ended up being the deciding factor. I think if the generic Republican who ran against Oz in the primary, David McCormick, nets an extra 1,000 votes because Donald Trump stays out of that race and stops meddling in fucking primaries, I think that the Republicans easily win that. They maintain that Senate seat, and that we could actually, still have the Senate be competitive today. I think Democrats did a pretty good job of fielding candidates, with a couple of exceptions like Beto and Stacey Abrams. They did a pretty good job of fielding good candidates who are able to, because you did have Biden with the transgender influencers and things like that. There are things that they do. And Gretchen Whitmer with COVID, it's not exactly woke, but she obviously was dealing with COVID, although her opponent was Michigan was crazy because there were petition problems with the actual Republican who was supposed to run against her.
Oh, really?
And he ended up getting kicked off the ballot. It was like a whole thing. So Michigan, they ended up with a really bad Republican candidate, as they did almost everywhere else. But I guess the point I would make to counter this a little bit, though, is that there were Democratic candidates who should have been more vulnerable insofar that they're in places where like crime is really bad or with the COVID restrictions. So like Whitmer is one, but Kathy Hochul, it's New York. So at the end of the day, the Democrat probably was always going to win that race unless it was an optimal environment for Republicans, which it wasn't quite. But you do look at like crime in New York is out of control. Illinois was never really supposed to be competitive, but we've all seen news coming out of Chicago about the crime there, and the Republican did pretty poorly there. That was a Trumpy Republican. The Los Angeles mayoral race is really interesting because it was, I think Rick Caruso was a de facto Republican. He may be a very just sort of moderate Democrat as I understand it, but he was a de facto Republican in that race. He actually had a lot of support from celebrities in Los Angeles who are getting sick of having their limos broken into by homeless people and people, shitting on the front of their Beverly Hills mansions. There were and he lost to the more woke kind of progressive candidate, Karen Bass. So there were some cases where you would think that maybe there'd be a little bit of the kind of uprising we saw in San Francisco when Chesa Boudin, the woke district attorney, was thrown out mostly by like Asian Americans in the San Francisco area. We didn't see that. And that was something that I'd hoped maybe we could see a little bit of. Came kind of close to New York. New York was really interesting. I actually have some hope for Lee Zeldin maybe starting a little bit of a coming alive of the New York Republican Party. But yeah, so the Democrats overall had a pretty good slate of candidates.
Did I lose you, Scott? All right, you're back.
We had a little. When did I cut out?
Right after you mentioned Lee Zeldin maybe building something in New York.
Okay. Well, I'm all but certain that it was still recording, so I'm just gonna. The last thing that I said was Oh shoot.
No, I can hear you. Okay, it's good. It's very small, but
okay. Hopefully not too many issues.
I was about to just break in if you want me to go in there.
Yeah, the last thing that I said, though, just because I want to make sure it matches up with the recording, the last thing that I said was the Democrats did a pretty good job of having a good slate of candidates.
Yeah. But I want to answer the question you kind of opened this little subpart with, Scott, is whether I think this will embolden the woke going forward. And we have now a divided Congress, and divided Congress is going to require compromise. And the woke ideology does not truck compromise. It is ideological. It is totalitarian. It does not compromise well. So if anything is going to happen in Congress, there's going to have to be compromise. The woke do not have the Republicans, and they don't have the centrist Democrats, except for those issues in which the Democrats were just going to win anyway. That's not the case anymore. So I don't think it's going to be emboldened that much going forward, at least federally, because of the divided Congress.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid if the Democrats had actually maintained control of the House of Representatives, which they very nearly did, there would just be no check on, because now there is a small check on the Biden presidency. Because, by the way, Democrats gaining a seat in the Senate is significant because the sort of Joe Manchin de facto moderate filibuster that he's been able to enact there in West Virginia, the moderate Democrat Joe Manchin, is gone at this point. And what you actually need if you're Republicans is you need both him and the second most moderate Democrat, Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, which they often do vote the same, but you do need both of them now because there are 51 seats in all likelihood. I'm pretty much assuming, again, that Herschel Walker loses his runoff. We'll see if that ends up being true. So it was more important than ever, considering that Republicans at least narrowly take the House, and they did by the skin of their teeth. They only appear to have maybe a 4-seat majority in the House. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the woke thing stands to maybe be checked a little bit in the House of Representatives. I mean, I guess one thing I want to talk about before we move on to Donald Trump is, what do we want to see out of something that we haven't had for a few years now, which is a Republican majority in one chamber of Congress? I mean, I know that, there's the opportunity. I want to see things like investigations into, gender affirming care for children, again, putting that in air quotes, into critical race theory in schools. What I don't want to see are investigations into Hunter Biden, which is the kind of things that we're hearing they're going to have. I don't care that Hunter Biden smokes crack and fucks hookers. I don't give a shit. I just don't care. Now, look, if he is watching something I don't think I can say on YouTube, something that is abbreviated with the abbreviation C and P, if Hunter Biden is watching that, right. Whoopsie, almost. But anyway, if Hunter Biden is looking at that kind of stuff and committing serious crimes, or if he is funneling money into Joe Biden's account from Ukrainian bankers or something, like, yes, by all means. The fact that he smokes crack and fucks hookers that I believe are all 18 years or older, I just don't care. I just don't give a shit. And I'm so sick of the Republicans acting like Joe Biden having a loser of a son matters that much when there's like kids getting their perfectly healthy breasts getting cut off all across the country.
The only thing that tells me is Hunter Biden's bad at covering it up. So it's not like members of Congress, members of the administration, and their family members aren't also doing shit like that. It's just that Hunter Biden's really bad at covering it up. So, Ben, to move us kind of from the legislative to the executive, which is our next topic, there was a lot of chatter before these midterms that if we saw this huge red tsunami or even a red wave, that Joe Biden's prospects of being the candidate were going to be diminished or different. Now that hasn't happened. Do you think that that chatter was justified in the first place? Do you think the situation's different now? Do you think Biden will be the head of the ticket for the Democrats in 2024?
This is another silver lining. Is that this is what I've been thinking about since the election, and what's been helping me sleep at night is it was a terrible result for Trump, a good result for DeSantis, and it was also a pretty good result for Joe Biden. I mean, I do think that this midterm, escape that he's done, where he barely lost the House and didn't really get dinged in any other meaningful way, I think it means he'll probably be the candidate in 2024. It's pretty unprecedented for a incumbent president not to at least attempt to run for re-election. Of course, Joe Biden's very advanced age, I believe he is about 80 years old, puts that into question. The fact that he is not particularly popular even within his own party. He's not a very inspiring candidate the way that his Democratic predecessor Barack Obama was. But hey, look, if Hillary Clinton could be coronated and she's an even worse candidate than Joe Biden is, Joe Biden, I do believe that 80-year-old Joe Biden might be a better candidate than, 65-year-old Hillary Clinton was. I mean, she was just atrocious, and she was, they attempted to coronate her and were barely able to do so over Bernie Sanders' upstart 2016 campaign. But I do think that we are looking at a situation now where Biden is 90% going to be the candidate. Maybe he decides, maybe his health really starts to become an issue. And so he, decides to take a pass, and then you get Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg or Gavin Newsom or whoever it might be. I think those are the three who it could hypothetically be. But we've got a dog visitor for our audio listeners. This is, if my cat were in here, if my cat were in here, it would be the Podcats from Dark Horse with Brett Weinstein. Yeah. But no, my cat is not going to make a cameo today. I think he's only been on the show once. But anyway, to answer your question, Ben, I think that I do think that Biden's probably going to be the candidate. I think if not, it comes down to Buttigieg, Harris, and Newsom, who are all kind of interesting. Harris is the worst by far of those three. It's not even a question. Harris would probably lose to Trump. Kamala Harris cannot be the Democrats, and I think they know that. I don't even know if they're going to let her launch a bid. Democrats have a pretty iron grip on who runs for president in their party, and I don't think Harris is going to be able to do much. But Buttigieg and Newsom are certainly much more formidable candidates than Biden, and I just don't think they're going to be able to challenge him, considering that he's probably going to run as the incumbent.
Yeah, but I think that's right.
Yeah, basically in agreement there. But where things are getting really interesting, and that we did want to take some time to talk about this on the show. Donald Trump is running for president again. Everybody kind of already knew this was going to happen. He officially announced just about a week after the midterms, which is unprecedented in terms of how early that is. Typically, you would wait until at least after Christmas, after midterm to announce for president. I remember Jeb Bush announced on December 27th. 2014, and it was like, wow, that's really early. But this is just, Donald Trump was like, I'm not wasting any time. Yes, I'm running again. Yes, you all knew that my ego would cause me to do this, and he is running again. We're going to have to talk about him a lot for the next couple of years. There was a hope that maybe we wouldn't, but Donald Trump will be a recurring theme on the show because the man is running for president again. And so, I'll just say really quick, and then Ben, I'll have you jump in. I'm just going to make something very clear on this show. I think I've made it pretty clear at this point. I am going to formally endorse Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida in the Republican primary, bright and early. It's been pretty clear that he is my chosen candidate, but I don't think I've put it in formal endorsement terms. I am supporting Ron DeSantis in the Republican primaries in 2024. I hope he runs, and I hope he wins, and I hope he beats Joe Biden and becomes the what are we on? 47th president of the United States? I'm not even sure at this point.
That's right.
I hope he becomes 47 for U.S. presidents. Donald Trump is not my guy. Never has been. I have never voted for him in any of the 4 elections, 2 primaries and 2 general elections in which he has ran. I voted for Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Some regrets there, although I actually will defend my Clinton general election vote to this day in that election. I voted for Andrew Yang in the Democratic primaries in 2020, and I voted for Tulsi Gabbard as a write-in candidate in the general election in 2020. I did not vote for Biden or Trump. I'm open to anything. We'll see how the next couple of years go. It is very hard for me to support Donald. And I will say that for all the people, and I want to take a second maybe later to try and steelman his candidacy, but for all the people that think that he has all of these unique strengths that make him a good culture warrior, I ask you, what happened with wokeness between 2016 and 2020? Did it get weaker or did it get stronger? How good of a culture warrior in chief was Donald Trump? Not so great, in my opinion. And I do think that Ron DeSantis will be a significantly better culture warrior in chief, which from my perspective is what I want out of the leader of the Republican Party at this point. But Ben, I want to give you a chance to jump in here. What do you make of the fact that we have Donald Trump's candidacy? We do not have a DeSantis candidacy yet, although it seems more likely than not that he's going to see this as his moment and probably jump in. His polling is looking really good against Trump. He's actually creeping up in the polls on Trump. What do you think of the situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I always am a little hesitant to blame Donald Trump for the culture war getting so crazy during his term, because it's kind of like, yeah, he's bad, but what caused that craziness is the reaction to him. And it wasn't necessarily so many of the things he actually did. Now, the things that people said that he stood for, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, racism, whatever, those I think were mostly mirages that were projected upon him. When it came to actual policies, I don't think we saw that much of that. It was just a lot of interpretation and dislike of him. But what is this going to do for our discourse? What is this going to do for the culture war? And it's going to make it very dumb. As dumb as it is, it's either going to stay the same or it's going to get dumber. If there is a primary sin in all of these type of discussions, other than us, of course, Scott, it's the lack of nuance for the purpose of pushing an agenda. And if a single person personified the concept of lack of nuance to push an agenda, that person is Donald Trump. And the agenda he's pushing is not even a principled one. The agenda is, I'm awesome, fuck you if you disagree. The culture wars were already so dumb and dumbfounding and distracting. Let me put it this way. If a party is already loud and raucous, an asshole with a bottle of tequila and a megaphone is not going to make that situation better.
Yeah. I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, Ben. I really wanted Donald Trump to sit this one out. He is close to Joe Biden in age. He's constitutionally bound to only serve one term maximum, even if he were to somehow miraculously win the next presidential election. He could only serve one more term. His main opponent is from a large swing state where he seems to have a sort of iron grip over the state and could deliver Florida's 29. I am, of course, referring to DeSantis. DeSantis is 45 years old, can actually serve 2 terms, and would deliver Florida's 29 electoral votes guaranteed. Right there on paper, you have a better candidate. And then we get into the real discussion, which is, the meat of who these people are. I will say, back to something you said, Ben, Donald Trump was treated unfairly by the media throughout his presidency. They would accuse him of doing many things which he did not do. They would absolutely exaggerate things and accuse him of doing things that he did not do. But at the end of the day, he just made it so easy for them. He never made adjustments. I'm a football fan, folks. And so I think of the fact that when you're losing in the first half in a football game, and Donald Trump got shellacked in the 2018 midterms, you make adjustments in the second half. Donald Trump never made any adjustments. He never said, okay, I seem to be providing a lot of ammunition to these charlatans in the media, to these activists, to the Democrats who want to defame me and accuse me of things I did not necessarily do. Maybe I make some adjustments. He never did that because Donald Trump seems almost completely incapable of that level of introspection. I appreciate the fact that he is strong in his convictions, if you can call them that. He certainly sticks to his guns. And that is a quality that I do want to have in the culture warrior in chief, if we're going to have one. But I would like to have that without all of the baggage that Trump brings. If I were to steelman Trump's candidacy, I would certainly go with the fact that, as I understand it, people who like him think that he has a unique ability because he does not have a lot of nuance, because he does not engage in a lot of introspection. He has a sort of unique ability to be a sort of battering ram, to just ram through anything the Democrats throw at him. Teflon Trump, that's what he was called for a while. And I appreciate that. And yet he is not Teflon. He lost the 2018 midterms very badly. He lost the 2020 election pretty badly. And he lost the 2022 midterms with his slate of endorsements very, very badly. He's not made of Teflon. Donald Trump doesn't win as he claims so often that he does. He loses quite a lot. He hasn't won since 2016. And that was a big one. And I give him all the credit in the world for the fact that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton fair and square in 2016. And I don't think it was some kind of fucking Russian interference. That's nonsense.
No.
He won that one. But since then, he has done, I think, little to nothing for the conservative movement, for the anti-woke movement. And you have a young upstart governor who's been doing all the right things and who has certainly earned my endorsement. And so I kind of want to shift the conversation to, and Ben, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you're also probably, given the choice between DeSantis and Trump, you're going with DeSantis?
Between those two options, yes. But obviously,
you're more libertarian.
Obviously, I'm Dave Smith, Michael Malice, 2024. So
fair enough. But if you were gun to your head in the Republican primary,
I'm just so tired of Trump. I'm tired of I get his unique. We're getting ready for today, and I kind of watched a little bit of his announcement speech, and just this feeling came over me that I haven't had for a while. It's like, oh, this is what I'm listening to again. This disorder. I mean, even this speech was teleprompted. I mean, he wasn't extemporaneous, but I just had that feeling of this is what I'm listening to. This style of speech, this structure of argument. I just am tired of it.
Yeah. No, I watched like 2 seconds of that speech. I just couldn't take it. I couldn't bother to watch it. He never pivots. There was all these jokes in 2016 about, will Donald Trump pivot? Will he pivot to the general election? Will he pivot to being a proper and professional president? He does not pivot. He does not make adjustments. I do want to talk about it seems likely candidacy of Ron DeSantis, although he has not announced yet, and he may not for several months. Traditionally, by the way, for my listeners who don't know, you usually don't announce you're running for president until January or February of the year previous to the election at the earliest. You can wait until the fall even of 2023 in this case. That would be the latest, would be like August, really. So anytime between January and August of next year would be the normal time to announce your candidacy. So Ron DeSantis, we may not hear from him for a while, whether or not he's going to run.
And he did just get reelected. It's a little weird to get reelected and then turn around and be like, no, I'm going for this job.
Although there were people at they certainly wouldn't mind it. The people at his rally were chanting 2 more years, which I loved. But I guess I want to take a few minutes at the end of the show here to talk about what a DeSantis challenge to Trump will look like. First off, I think this kind of goes without saying. Ben, do you think there are any candidates that we're really leaving out of the conversation? I mean, the other candidates that poll above 1%, they poll at like 2 to 5% in the Republican primary are Pence, Cruz, Haley, and Rubio. I don't think any of them have any shot. No, I think they're basically irrelevant.
I don't think so. I think you're right.
Yeah, it's a 2-man race between DeSantis and Trump. And I would think that one of the things that I'd like to see is, and tell me if you think this is actually a good strategy or if it's maybe a little too quixotic, or if you think it's something that's realistic, Ben. And I'd love to hear from those of you in the comments if you think this is realistic, because it's something I've been very interested in. I want to see non-elected officials in the Republican Party, because nobody cares about Mike Pence or Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy at the end of the day. I want to see people who are very important in the conservative movement outside of public office holders, namely Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, who are kind of the big two, but also perhaps Dave Rubin, Steven Crowder, Jordan Peterson, people who actually do hold sway among conservatives. Like, they really do. I want to see those people endorse Ron DeSantis, and I will incentivize them, or if need me be, bully them into doing so if I can. And by the way, for what it's worth, Ben Shapiro has strongly signaled that he probably will endorse Ron DeSantis. He's kind of gotten out front. I think Matt Walsh has already hit, one of his main people at the Daily Wire has already endorsed Ron DeSantis. Ben Shapiro seems not far behind his protege, Matt Walsh. Tucker Carlson has not said anything as of yet, but we'll see. I think all these people need to get in line. Like, if they want to save their party, if they want to save their movement, I know that the fear, of course, is that Donald Trump has a tendency to retaliate strongly to being rejected in any number of ways. But people need to man up. People have got to man up. You can't let him bully you again, because what you have that you didn't have in 2016 is one candidate to rally around, and that is Ron DeSantis. In 2016, there was this sort of circular firing squad, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, and John Kasich, all siphoning off each other's votes. Donald Trump was only winning like 35, 40% of the votes in all those primaries, but he kept winning without getting a majority. There's an opportunity here, and Ben, tell me if you think this is realistic, to just have everyone get behind DeSantis and to end this thing, as quickly as possible.
So a couple of things there. First, I have solved the circular firing problem. Firing squad problem. What we do is we have because the problem, I think that worked for Trump because he was a politician like no other. He was so different than all the other suits with their talking points, standing on a stage being grilled by Megyn Kelly or whoever was moderating those debates. So we have the insane circle firing squad. What we need is a bunch of other Trumpists and then a normie. So we get Carrie Lake and Mastriano, the My Pillow guy, Alex Jones, Trump, and then Justin Amash. And then Justin Amash is the person that's standing to the side of the firing line while the other crazy people tackle each other. That's how we solve that problem, and it will make it an incredibly entertaining election.
I like that. You could throw Ben Carson in there. Yeah, I remember he was. Yeah.
If you're asking me how I think we beat Trump in the primaries, I don't know why I'm saying we, but how Trump is beat in the primaries is, I think the ultimate question that boils down to is, how do we dissolve his base? One way to dissolve his base is what I think DeSantis has already done in Florida. I watched a video from Michael Moynihan, who's with Vice and the Fifth Column podcast, did some interviews on election day this year in Florida of people praising DeSantis wildly for all that he's done in Florida, especially like him being really good on the recent hurricane. But they were also talking about him basically not being the stooge that Donald Trump can be. Outside of Florida, I don't know how to dissolve his base. I'm sure. I mean, I think Tucker Carlson would probably be a big part of that. Ben Shapiro, the Daily Wire people, all the people you mentioned would probably help. I'm just not 100% sure that gets to the person who owns 4 Trump Punisher t-shirts. And that's 20% of the Republican Party? Like, yeah. I just don't know.
More than that, it's probably 30%.
I don't know how you cut. I just don't know how you remove the glue between those type of people and Donald Trump. And even if you bring all the big figurehead pundits of the Republican Party, or at least conservatism, I'm not sure it does it.
This, to me, though, is the beauty of DeSantis. So I think that you're 100% correct, Ben, and I was worried about this before DeSantis rose so much in stock over the course of the past few weeks. I was worried that if DeSantis didn't run and Trump's main competitor was a sort of squishy, uninspiring candidate like a Pence or a Rubio or a Haley or a Cruz, who are the other possible contenders here, or Mike Pompeo also, or whoever, like, then it's like those people have no appeal to Trump's base. They cannot siphon off any of his support. They're only going to get the anti-Trump. Because in the Republican Party, you got 3 things. You got I love Trump. You got I'm somewhat neutral towards Trump. I could kind of take him or leave him. And you got anti-Trump. Anti-Trump, like truly anti-Trump, is a pretty small amount of the party. It's like 10 to 15%. I love Trump is like 25, 30%. And you got most people, I think, in between the Republican Party who are like pretty persuadable about Trump. They're like, he's a Republican. If he's the nominee, I'll support him. But I could also consider going for someone else. Those people, I think that DeSantis appeals to them strongly. But what DeSantis can really do that no other candidate can, other than Donald Trump, is appeal to Trump's base. Ron DeSantis does not alienate those folks. He is a strong candidate in that, in the purest sense of the word strong. He has that kind of strength, that kind of tell it like it is quality that I think Trump has, maybe not to the same extent. And there's probably a certain number of those people that are like, I support Trump and Trump only. They've basically sworn an oath. I mean, they showed up at his Mar-a-Lago estate with Trump signs when his home was being raided, saying like, this man is Jesus Christ, as far as I'm concerned. And so sure, there's going to be people you can't get, but DeSantis has the magical ability. If it were a video game, it would be like a special ability that no one else has. DeSantis has the ability to be somewhat reasonable, and I don't think moderate is the right word, but just sort of like somebody that independents and suburban moms can vote for, and also simultaneously appeal to Trump's base. And no one else can do that. That's why he's the only legitimate challenger, is because he has walked a tightrope that no one else has. Not Mike Pence, not Marco Rubio, not Ted Cruz. Only Ron DeSantis, I believe, can do that, can say, hey, look, I give Trump voters 90% of what they want. So for anyone where 90% is good enough, it's an A-, it's not bad,
right? Then,
he's an option.
Do you think that he's got a vulnerability as being seen as one of the elites against which the Trumpists rail? I mean, what is he, a double Harvard graduate for undergrad and law school, I think? So he does... I think he is going to have to worry about that image. I think how he comes off in his speaking and how he comes off, it does not betray that, but I can see that being a vulnerability, at least in some sense.
You're 100% correct, and that is going to be Ron DeSantis's job to deal with that potential pitfall. And you're absolutely right that when it comes to the way he debates Trump, I think that he really needs to focus on like, look, Mr. President, I appreciate everything you've done, and I appreciate the people who support you. My pitch to them is, look at what I have done in Florida. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at what I have actually been able to do. And that, frankly, Mr. President, you lost in 2020. You are constitutionally bound to only serve one term, even if you won. You look at me, look at him. You know, it's the Old Spice commercial. Just look at me, look at him. Like, if he is disciplined enough and he doesn't do anything too elitist, nothing about the basket of deplorables, you know, like if he avoids Hillary Clinton in sort of Nikki Haley-esque uncanny valley situations, which, like you said, I think he's pretty good at doing. That's a potential pitfall for him. If he ends up sort of giving off a Mitt Romney kind of vibe, he's not going to win this primary. Mitt Romney would be on the opposite end of the spectrum, where I think Mitt Romney is a very nice guy. He's clearly a very nice person. Not a great presidential candidate, and that's why he was never elected president. Has that sort of squishy elitist vibe. And DeSantis would do well to say, how can I not be quite as Trumpy as Trump, but not go full Mitt Romney, not go full Hillary Clinton? Mm-hmm. I think it's a vulnerability for sure. And it is his job and his campaign manager's job to make sure that he works around that. And I think that the capability is there because he's a very talented politician, a very talented speaker.
But, yeah, and probably a cleaner cut. I mean, at least I haven't heard the tape where Ron DeSantis is saying you can just grab women by the pussy. So, and I don't know. Maybe is that this is what I don't understand. Like, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, like, well, DeSantis doesn't have like all the skeletons we've seen about Trump. Trump's skeletons seem to help him. Like, yeah. People totally bought that locker room talk thing. They're like, oh, he's just one of the boys talking about grabbing pussy in the locker room. Like, it's the weirdest thing in the world. But DeSantis doesn't have that. I think that's a positive, but in the upside down clown world we live in, I just don't.
I do think it's a positive. I actually think that Donald Trump would have won by a stronger margin if not for the Access Hollywood tapes in 2016. I do think it hurt him a little bit. People will say that it helped him because he ended up winning. I think he won more so because of the James Comey letter that was released 2 weeks before the election. I think that was not particularly helpful. Mr. Comey, but we'd love to have him on the show. Maybe chat about that for a minute. But in any case, this has been the Veritas Podcast. We're going to sign off for today. We're going to be talking about Trump, unfortunately, probably a decent amount over the course of the next year or so. My hope is that there's a swift end to this primary. Look, I know a lot of you in the audience are probably Trump guys. And you know what? If you're Trump people, comment what you think and steel man his candidacy. I can be convinced of pretty much anything. I'm an open-minded guy. Tell me why you think Trump is the man to be president, to be the Republican candidate in 2024. Or if you agree with me about DeSantis, I'd love to hear about that as well. But if you disagree, if you're a Trump person, I appreciate you listening to us kind of shitting on him a little bit. And who knows, maybe if it's like Harris versus Trump, maybe I'll even vote for him. Maybe. But we'll see. We'll see. I might have to write somebody in again. But in any case, this is the Veritas Podcast. We look forward to speaking to you more about this over the coming weeks and months. Please leave 5 stars if you're on iTunes. Like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. See you next time on the Veritas Podcast.